Thank you, everyone who is presented on Zoom. I know there are a lot of Zoom meetings, so I'm really grateful to have you here. And I'm especially grateful to have this platform because preparing for the talk was also an opportunity for me to go back to my materials and reflect on them. So this talk is based on my larger PhD project, which was completed in December 2019, in which I utilized Mecca as a lens in multiple different senses, as a physical site, as an imagined homeland, also as a diplomatic theater, and a kind of a model for replications or substitutes of Mecca as little Meccas in China. But in today's talk, I'll talk more about the actual migrations and formations of diaspora communities in Saudi Arabia or the western coast of, of Saudi Arabia that has been mediated by Mecca and the pilgrimage. I think it's almost redundant to say that Mecca has historically been a transnational and transregional place, given its position as a destination for the annual pilgrimage or the Hajj. And scholars have looked at Mecca in conjunction with Hajj from different perspectives. And some have looked at it from the viewpoint of state entities, whether they're empires or nation states, and how regulating or facilitating the Hajj was important for different imperial states and nation states for their own interests. And others, I think, have also looked at the unifying aspects of the Hajj for all those participating in it, or the Hajj as a focal point for encounters or different imaginings of the world, or as a foci for universal Islamic world ideas. And there's also research on Hajj diplomacy. But I think a relatively under-examined aspect of Mecca, its place as a conduit for diaspora populations, where the city and the areas around it are a kind of collection of diaspora populations from across Asia that I'll kind of hint throughout the presentation. And I'm approaching this angle from the perspective of Chinese Muslim communities. And by doing that, what I'm trying to do is to take an external place of Mecca and use that to examine the transnational networks of Chinese Muslim communities over the course of the 20th century, which gives a different perspective on their the rhythms of their network formations, or the kind of dynamism and pulsations. And what I'm also hoping to do is to use that perspective of Chinese Muslims to look at Mecca and Saudi Arabia at large from a point of view of supposed outsiders, and kind of diversify the scholarship on a place that tends to be portrayed as a kind of monolithic in terms of religious makeup and demographics. So for the talk, will be organized in three main sections. First, I'll go over the broad pilgrimage routes and their utilizations as paths of exile, roughly from the mid-19th century to 1950s, just to get a sense of the geographic reach of the different pilgrimage routes. And in the second section, I'll focus on a rather small and single endowment institution that was used by pilgrims from China from the 1920s to the present. And I want to highlight that institution as a microcosm for observing transregional circulations of persons and donations, and how they reroute over time at the face of historical events. And lastly, I want to end with the multifaceted ways that the diaspora communities have returned to their homes from Saudi Arabia to mainland China, and the other way around, that was in part mediated by the pilgrimage to Mecca in the wake of in the wake of the opening up of the PRC in the 1980s. So I want to start with this figure named Ma Fuchun or Yusuf Shinawi, who was mentioned in one of the archives that I was looking at. And this archival material itself was composed by a Chinese Islamic pilgrimage delegation of 1939. And they encountered this figure who was an escapee from Yunnan in the aftermath of Duwonshu rebellion, and he was already approaching his mid 70s, and he was engaged in trade. So what it highlights is the role of the pilgrimage in facilitating these kinds of exiles and escapes from the borderlands of Yunnan as early as or as early as the 1960s and 70s. And what that also hints is the connected geographies between Yunnan and Mecca that went through Burma and the Indian Ocean. And although the archival material itself doesn't really discuss the specifics of this exile pilgrimage, we can sort of imagine or gain insights from the other historical materials. And as early as the 14th century, there were observations or indirect observations rather, that Mecca was reachable from Yunnan through land within 1 year or through the seas. But what Ma Fuchun likely followed was the path of Ma Dexin, who left his pilgrimage account from which he undertook between 1840 and 1848. And like Ma Fuchun, who is described as having come to Mecca through Yunnan and Burma, Ma Dexin also took this route with the caravan merchants and through the Indian Ocean. So this is a brief map of, or a rather simple map that I drew after reading his pilgrimage account. And what he did was he went with the caravan merchants to Yangon through the Irrawaddy River and sailed across the Indian Ocean. And when he returned, it was also just the time when the port cities administered by the British empires were opening and already in operation. So he would transit in Penang and Singapore and also come back through Canton and sail through the Pearl River to return back to Yunnan. And although it was a time of great influence of the British Empire in its interest in shipping, it was also a place of also a space of encounters, at least for Ma Dexin, because when he describes in his travel log in very brief points his stays and encounters. For example, in Yangon he stayed with a merchant from Surat who had been there for a long time, and in Mecca he actually stayed in a house of a Jawi person, and Jawa being used as a reference point for Southeast Asia or the Malay world more broadly. So so it was a space of encounters, in addition to being influenced by imperial interests. And he also mentioned in the appendum the northern route of the pilgrimage, and he described it in very brief details, or only the place names, some of which I couldn't match onto present day locations, but basically he identified the stops from Jiaoyuan to Bukhara, and then he identified two ways, one over north and the over the south, which hints that there was an awareness about the pilgrimage routes that would lead from the present-day Xinjiang through Central Asia to Mecca, which was probably or it's I think it's safe to say much more vibrant and active travel route compared to what Madashin was going through. But if we compare that if we compare Madashin's travelogue to another Hajj account of 1924 by Ma Luan, who traveled from Chengdu to Mecca mostly using steamship routes, then we see like a dramatic shortening of the places that this pilgrim is visiting. And in contrast to Madashin, who took 8 years, Malian's journey was about 8 months. So there's a shortening of time and also places of transit. So going back to Mafuchun material, which there's a very little data on, the Islamic pilgrimage diplomatic delegations that were arriving in 1939 and ran into Mafuchun or Yusuf Shinawi were also a part of this steamship traffic that Ma Luan had used. So they were mostly intellectuals and politicians coming from Beijing and Shanghai. And what they observed were quite a number of what they described as Huachao, in which were included populations in present-day Xinjiang. And they observed that about 2,000 of them were residing in the Hejaz, or the western coast of the Arabian Peninsula, and most of them were Turkic Muslims, and a small number of people from Yunnan, Gansu, Ningxia, and Sichuan province who had come for commerce or the pursuit of knowledge. And they were also describing the difficulties that these subjects were going through, and which were forcing them to become citizens of the Hejaz. And they had also had these political motives for trying to convince the nationalist government to make an outreach to them, which was a reaction against Imperial Japan's outreach to these exile communities from Xinjiang and Central Asia. I think Kelly Hammond also gave a talk at the institute, and her book also describes this dynamics. So in response to that, the Chinese Islamic pilgrimage delegations that were conducting anti-Japanese propaganda were also visiting Mecca and the routes and the points along that route, and they were also describing these diaspora communities from present-day Xinjiang. And I think that's kind of a missed or overlooked aspect, because in these pilgrimage accounts, Xinjiang populations are something that keeps appearing recurrently throughout the 1930s and 40s and 50s and even onto the 60s. So I wanted to point that out, although that is not the primary focus of my research, but the point is that these geographies from different parts of China to the Arabian Peninsula are overlapping, although these populations may keep separate networks. But the turning point really for what we know as Chinese Muslims or Hui populations, the turning point for their settlements in the outskirts of Mecca or Ta'if more specifically, was the arrival of the former warlord and governor of Qinghai province, Ma Bufang. And I think a lot of people are familiar with the story, depending on who you talk to. But Ma Bufang, who was allied with the Nationalist Party, took 200 to 300 of his close political affiliates and families to Saudi Arabia when he was escaping from mainland China after the victory of the Communist Party. And he was really one of the last persons who were fighting in the Northwest provinces. And what's interesting also is that he and his family, as well as the neighboring provincial governor, Ma Hongkwei, were airlifted by Claire Chenault, who had been a retired U.S. Army Naval Army officer who set up a kind of civilian transport service and helped the nationalists in uh, supplying food supplies and so on during the the Civil War after World War II, and he airlifted Ma Bufang and his family and political associates from um, China to Hong Kong, and Mecca was where Ma Bufang's close associates headed. And these are some of the pictures that were kept in his private house in Xining, which were taken in 2014. But um, it's not really clear whether the house is still operating. I think it's been shut down in the past 2-3 years. And this airlifting also shows how the mode of transport is changing for the Hajj, as well as it being a turning point for the formation of Chinese diaspora communities in the Hejaz. And actually, Ma Bufang and his close associates didn't settle in Mecca or Jeddah, but they chose to go to Cairo and then stay there for 7 years or so. But in 1956, with the full rise of Nasser, they decided to come back. And when they did that, Ma Bufang came in the name of the Hajj once again as the leader of the Taiwanese Islamic delegation or the pilgrimage delegation. So it's the Hajj was and is a kind of a convenient excuse for these exiled or political leaders to escape to different places. And after coming back to Mecca, many of the people who traced their origins to Gansu and Qinghai decided to settle in Ta'if because of the familiar weather and the topography, and probably also because of the rising rent in Mecca. So on the left is a picture of the Chinese Muslim cemetery in Cairo that was endowed by Ma Bufang, and it says the cemetery of Chinese family and China's Muslim population's grave. And after the arrival of Ma Bufang and his close associates, also individual refugees trickled into Mecca and its neighboring regions through the 1950s, and the route that they used were from different parts of Gansu through Tibet and through India and to Jeddah. And these are some of the places that are central on Sino-Tibetan trade routes. And these are kind of old routes, but into the 1950s, there were individual escapees who were escaping from anti-rightist collectivization campaigns and using these overland pathways, which was a very difficult journey, to come to Mecca in the name of the pilgrimage. And here is a passport of one passport or pilgrimage pass, rather, not so much a passport, but pilgrimage pass for one such person, and it was issued in Bombay. So he would have taken a very difficult journey from southern Gansu through Tibet, through Kalimpong and Kolkata and Mumbai or Bombay, and reached Mecca and joined the community in Ta'if. So by 1961, according to the survey of the Embassy of the Republic of China or Taiwan on overseas populations in Saudi Arabia, there were about 271 persons from Gansu, Qinghai, Tibet, Ningxia, Yunnan, Sichuan, two from Xinjiang, and one from Hong Kong, interestingly. But it also shows that the populations from Xinjiang were already out of reach to the Taipei embassy in Jeddah. They had much become a part of the Central Asian communities in the Hejaz. So, and the Embassy of Republic of China obviously had its political reasons for surveying these populations, and my guess is also that in 1961 was also the year that Saudi Arabia required standardization of identification cards. So the issue of citizenship and residency becomes more important in this period. So the Embassy of China surveying these populations has also practical reasons, because are they have to have some kinds of papers. So many of them would end up getting Taiwanese passports, although um, although the people surveyed here ended up getting citizenship later on after 18 years of age and so on. Those who didn't have access to citizenship would take Taiwanese passports, and some of them would still keep Taiwanese passports. And the populations from Tibet is interesting. And what I found out from the fieldwork was that a lot of them were women that had been brought from not so much Tibet, but in the borderlands, who were brought in a way for male populations of the Chinese community who couldn't find marriage partners because of their social status. So so that's majority of the Tibet populations that you see is I think would be a part of those populations from for brought in for marriage purposes. And before I go on to tracing down the lives or the reroutings of these diaspora communities, I want to bring your attention to endowment institutions that exist in Mecca. And there's not many for China's pilgrims, but endowment institutions are really microcosms that are emblematic of the phenomenon of networks forming institutions that in turn mediate circulations of people. And endowment institutions or riba or awqaf in Mecca, I think it's a pretty under-researched topic, at least in the English language. And there are descriptions about Central Asian lodging houses that were taken in the late 19th century. And Norihiro Naganawa talks a little bit about it. And the Dutch Orientalist Snoek Hergronje, who visited Mecca through the Hajj, is a kind of a scholar slash maybe a spy, or in a way that who supposedly converted to Islam, but took ethnographic surveys and left a great account of the social world of Mecca. And his main focus was Indonesia, given that he was Dutch Orientalist, or he later also worked for the diplomatic service of the Dutch. So he also describes these waqf houses that were used by Jawi populations, and both of these observations note how these waqf houses were organized along regional lines, so that they would host they would tend to host people from the same region. So it's kind of similar to Huiguan in Chinese societies, and people that I talked to, some of the people that I talked to in Jeddah would actually describe waqf houses as Huiguan. And there are two lodging houses in Mecca that we may call Chinese, and one was in through the endowment of the Gansu warlord Ma Fuxiang, who's a different family line from Ma Bufang, but of the father of Ma Honghui. For those of you who are not familiar with these Ma warlords. And there's another one that was supposedly endowed by Ma Bufang in the Jihad region after he returned from Cairo, which I can talk a little bit more about later. But Ma Fuxiang's donations were allegedly carried by a Sufi scholar from Ningxia in the 1920s. And in the periodicals in the 1930s, there are observations that this waqf was in use, that there were, for example, Ma Mingdao, who was a student in Ankara and performing the pilgrimage from Istanbul for different reasons, describes that there were 4 Chinese pilgrim lodge houses in Mecca, one for Dongam people, one for Kashgar, one for Ili, and one for Hami. But he also notes that although the housings were divided in this way, the boundaries were not actually clear on the ground. So they seem to have been cross-used by one another. And he runs into these politicians from Qinghai who were staying there, and people from Henan. And he would also encounter pilgrims from China who had come through the Shanghai route that I showed earlier from Malia's pilgrimage account, or through India. So there are multiple kinds of routes existing in that period, and on to the 1960s. And what's really interesting is how this waqf was destroyed and reconstructed more than once. So because this waqf fell under the boundaries of the expansion of the Haram in 1955, or the expansion of the Grand Mosque, it had to be destroyed. And the process of its destruction and reconstruction is described in the memoirs or diaries of Gao Wenyuan or Shamsuddin Ali, who had also escaped from Xining in Qinghai province, not with Ma Bufang, but through a different route, but be another story. So in his memoir, he recounts how he organized the donations to reconstruct this waqf that fell under the boundaries of destruction. So he mentions that he collected donations from Muslim communities and in Hong Kong and Thailand. And although he doesn't discuss specifically about Thailand, he also left records of people or the monies that were being brought in from Hong Kong, totaling about, I think, 20,000 US dollars at the time. And they were likely carried by Sahaji and Shaikun, and I haven't been able to find much information about them. But what's interesting is that when mainland China no longer had interactions with Saudi Arabia in the 1960s and 70s, it was through the different Muslim communities in Thailand and Hong Kong that this waqf institution was maintained. And then it was again destroyed because it fell under the expansion boundaries. And I thought that was the end of it. But when I happened to interview one of the senior members in the diaspora, he happened to be the watcher or the keeper of the waqf that had been revived since 2013. And according to him, that the waqf that had been destroyed, that had been rebuilt through donations from Hong Kong and Thailand, there was actually compensation money from them. And so what ended up happening was that another one was constructed to be used for new pilgrims arriving from mainland China who were coming for private purposes apart from the official pilgrimage delegation. And I put the picture in there for just to show, just to show faces to names and to give a sense of the meetings that I did. And now we're reaching the final part of the talk. So of course, before the revival of this work, the reunions were ongoing from the 1980s when mainland China um, opened up. And although diplomatic relations were established in 1990, there were unofficial visits from different parts of China to Mecca that was mediated by the World Muslim League or through the relatives' invitation visa. Um, so what ended up happening was that even though the diaspora communities in the Hejaz couldn't travel to China themselves, they would meet their relatives coming in through the Hajj um, for the first time in 30 or 40 years. And that was also a chance for the second generation community, second generation individuals to rediscover new homes, and especially for those who do not have citizenship and lack the social capital that many of their other colleagues have, or their many of their other relatives even have. That what the tendency is that recreating connections with their old homes in mainland China has been a source of another identification and also a kind of social capital. So I just want to highlight a few vignettes of how these reconnections were unfolded in the 1980s and onwards. So first, there was the case of Zainab and Hassan. Um, and Hassan was born and raised in Ta'if, but without citizenship. And what ended up happening was that his half sibling performed the pilgrimage in 1984, and that was the starting point of the reunion. And when he could travel, as soon as he could travel to mainland China, he would visit the families of his parents who had come from southern Gansu in Tibet, and he would reconnect with the extended family, and he would also find his marriage partner and from one of the extended families, and he would which was Zainab. And Zainab had been, when I met her, she had been living in Ta'if for nearly 30 years, and she hadn't come back for um, almost 30 years. And Zainab being there also led to her brothers and her brothers-in-law coming to Ta'if and to help Hassan's business, which was to trade or sell small-scale goods like vases and plates with his half-sibling who was based in China. So this was a kind of a way for them to really improve their fortunes in a way. And he would later end up opening tea shops in Jeddah and Ta'if. And for Zainab, who's a foreigner in Saudi Arabia but lived there for 30 years, being close to Mecca and Medina is really a source of comfort. And while she keeps connections with her old homes in mainland China, so she would send her daughters to study in Lanzhou for different kinds of reasons, but one of them being that due to their lack of citizenship status, they would have trouble in getting post-college education. And there were also rare cases of the first generation settlers returning to China in the 1980s in the name of religion or religious propaganda, but performing other things on the side as well. So the case of Abdullah Anasassini or Majinkli Abdullah Anasassini, who was one of the early settlers in Mecca and then Ta'if, who worked as a religious missionary in Saudi Arabia, who and had affiliations with the World Muslim League. He would go back, not so much go back, but because this was not his home, but he would go to a mosque in Chengdu and be appointed as headmaster for external affairs. So there are these religious connections, but on the side, he also would bring in clothing from Guangzhou and ship them in containers and sell them in Jeddah and Ta'if, according to what I talked to with his family. So as these reconnections are unfolding and Mecca providing a space for that, there also I also want to say that these are not so much all fluid connections and everyone identifying with Mecca, because a lot of things also depended on personal choices. So I want to highlight the outlooks of two graduates from the Islamic University in Medina. So these are students who came from mainland China throughout the 1990s and studied in Medina. And some of them would some of them would be married into the older diaspora communities in Ta'if. But if you look at the words of Faisal, or I would rather explain it, and Faisal had graduated from the Islamic University in Medina in the mid-1990s, and after graduating, he decided to go into business rather than to be involved in religious education. So he was from Qinghai, and he got to know his an old settler from Qinghai who was about his 70s. So what he said was that he sponsored this old man, Yaqub's trip back to Qinghai because Yaqub didn't really have the means of going back home. And he also the Medina University graduate Faisal also, when he started business, he needed a sponsor for to do his business operations in Saudi Arabia. So Yaqub's daughter would act as their company sponsor for business, and his outlook was a lot more real, in a starkly realistic and disappointed way, that this imagination of Mecca providing comfort was really absent, in that he was very critical of the society that he got to know while staying in Medina. And of course, one of the examples that he cited was Yaqub himself, who had lived in Saudi Arabia for 60 years but doesn't have citizenship. And he was also preparing to close down the business. And in contrast to that, Suleiman, who also graduated from the Islamic University in Medina, got to know his grand uncle, who had settled in Ta'if after escaping from Gansu in the 1950s. And he, in contrast to Faisal, decided to stay on in Saudi Arabia as acting as a missionary for that targeted populations from East Asia. So he explained that, this is a part of my job, and I have the residence permit, and it has a comfortable working hours. And in addition to that, praying in Mecca and Medina is equivalent to 1,000 times or 100,000 times elsewhere. So there are different kinds of newly arriving people from China, and through the 1990s, through educational purposes and striking new kinds of relationship with the existing diaspora communities. But their choices are also divergent. And I want to end with this note also, that that although living in proximity to Mecca, or the idea of having performed the pilgrimage for religious purposes, is a kind of source of comfort and solace for those who live there. And there is a kind of dual belongings to both Saudi Arabia and mainland China that's far away. There's also the aspect of loss that some of the second generation, especially, or third generation, feel that even when they do have citizenship, that and have the papers, that they feel like they're in between Saudi Arabia and China, that they're neither Saudi nor Chinese. And when they go to China, people say that they're not Chinese, that they don't look like Chinese. But in Saudi Arabia, people would say that they're not Saudi, even if they have documents and citizenship. So there is an aspect of not belonging anywhere while belonging everywhere. So I want to just conclude with a few points of what I try to do in this presentation and in my work in general, was to use the perspective of Mecca as a physical site and as a convergence point for mobilities, to highlight the dynamism of mobile societies whose channels of circulations across the geographies of China, the Indian Ocean, Central Asia, and the Arabian Peninsula preceded the Belt and the Road formations. And these mobile assemblages, you see a lot of intermeshing of religious travels with politics, exiles, ties of kinship, and small-scale commerce that tends to get lost through perspectives of interstate relations, although that's of course important. And what I want to propose or develop further is to conceptualize Mecca as a magnet for diasporas and mediator of transnational connections from across Asia. And it's a lens for us to look at inter-Asian spaces on a trans-regional intermediary level. So I want to end with that. And if you have any questions or comments, please feel free.